Hello, everybody, and welcome to Confrontational Histories, the YouTube channel that takes on bad historical myths and narratives. This is the follow up Coda video for the Robert E. Lee video that I had just done. If you didn't listen to the last one, and probably a lot of you didn't, um, didn't get a lot of circulation, these are kind of interstitial videos that I am doing with a less formal format where I respond to a lot of the comments and concerns and questions that I had on some of my previous videos. And boy, howdy, there were a lot of comments on this one. A lot of very thoughtful comments. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody, those who left positive comments, those who left constructive criticism, and even those who told me that I am a leftist, swagless beta male cuck, because at least that drives up engagement. So thank you, everybody. But I wanted to take a moment to actually respond to some of these things that people had said. Even a lot of the critical comments, I think, were coming from a good place, and I do want to address some of those while we're going through this. So I think one of the top sort of genres of comment that I had gotten was those that were saying something along the lines of that I was out of line or misrepresenting things, or that I wasn't looking at the Army of Northern Virginia's accomplishments in my video, and essentially interpreting it as though I was saying that Lee was a bad commander. And I don't actually think that Robert E. Lee was a terrible commander overall. I think he's an overrated commander, to be sure. The point of the video wasn't to say that Lee was wrong at all times or bad at all times or anything else like that. What I was trying to do with the video was point out the flaws with Lee's leadership, and just kind of analyze what Lee had done and what others had suggested that he do, and sort of talk about how these flaws in his generalship over time led to catastrophic results for the Army of Northern Virginia and for the Confederacy. I don't think that, just putting it out there, Lee was a poor collaborator and a poor communicator, full stop. That shows up in, you can read that in a lot of the accounts, first-hand accounts of a lot of the battles that go on. It shows up in a number of his battles where things were not coordinated very well, where there were a lot of orders that were confused. I essentially laid out 3 very clear examples of times that had happened. That was even during Lee's best year, his one good year, truly good year. And the thing is, when you're looking at a lot of these individual battles, when you're looking at it from the standpoint of the classical historiographies, a lot of folks who study the Civil War are aware of these mistakes by Lee. They're aware of the heavy reliance on frontal assaults. They're aware of the instances of confused orders. They're aware of the times that communication was poor. They're aware of the times that the Army of Northern Virginia snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. So that itself is not controversial. However, in the traditional historiographies and the way they're told, it's stated as, oh man, those dumb Billy Yanks couldn't whip Marse Robert even when he was making mistakes. And if I had presented the information like that, then that would not have been controversial to a lot of folks who didn't like the video, who left negative comments, because that is traditionally the way it's portrayed in the classical historiographies about the American Civil War. However, when you turn that on its head and do as I did and say, yeah, but that had dire consequences for his army down the road and led to the Army of Northern Virginia having to commit to a lot of actions that hurt them in the long run, well, all of a sudden, it's a controversial take. Like, do you get where I'm coming from there? So, yeah, it's and I just, just to point out, going beyond the example, the known example was that a lot of folks are aware of, um, in the actual battles themselves, in the factual accounts of the battles, as I said, having been traditionally portrayed as being signs that the Union is just that much more pathetic. There are a number of accounts and instances, and you can go out there, of Lee's generals and people in his own army, not just the generals, but also sergeants and privates, writing home, writing in personal journals about how poor the communication was in the Army in Northern Virginia. A.P. Hill's letters home are full of this sort of critique of Lee's leadership. I want to get back to the experiences of the average soldier in the Army of Northern Virginia in a little bit here later. But going back and looking at the second day of Gettysburg, there are a number of these stories that crop up throughout historiographies that are from a more Confederate sympathetic perspective and a more Lee sympathetic perspective. They talk about these grand councils that Lee held before battles. And there's actually incredibly little evidence that Lee ever held these grand planning and coordinating councils. And it seems like a lot of times like this is a response that, especially Jubal Early, but then a lot of folks who came after Early and used Early as a source, they're aware of this, the reality of the poor coordination and the poor communication within Robert E. Lee's command. And so they invent these instances where Lee did clearly state his objectives to his officers and made sure that everybody was on the same page. The second day at Gettysburg is a really great example of this. It even made it into the movie Gettysburg itself, where they have a scene that Lee brought together all of the Corps and division commanders and told them what his plan was for that day. And then in his own accounts, Early goes even further than that and states that Lee met with Hill and with Ewell the evening of the first day of the battle and told them that Longstreet had clear orders to attack at dawn. And there's no evidence whatsoever that ever happened, especially. But Ewell's accounts, Hill's accounts, and Longstreet's accounts all go against the notion that there was any grand council or morning briefing on the second day at Gettysburg. According to A.P. Hill's account, what had happened was he met Robert E. Lee and Longstreet on a stump. And they went over this is on the morning of the second day, and they went over sort of briefly what Lee's plan was, and Hill was told that his orders were to move as soon as Longstreet had touched off his assault. According to Ewell's account, Ewell had a meeting with Lee that morning, and Lee told him that he was to begin his assault as soon as the other two commanders got underway. And Ewell, according to his own words, believed that this was an unclear order, and he even protested with Lee, stating that his men, given the amount of fighting they had been involved in on the first day, that they would be demoralized by abandoning their prepared positions opposite Culp's Hill. And so he clearly expressed that he did not think that this was a good plan. However, Lee kind of ignored him basically and told him that this is what was supposed to happen. A lot of folks seem to imagine that there was some sort of grand coordination, and again, it's made it into a lot of the more mainstream histories, that there was supposed to be coordination between Ewell and Longstreet to attack simultaneously on the second day, and the actual accounts of the commanders who were there completely go against that. There was, in fact, so much confusion with the orders just between Longstreet and Hill, let alone getting Ewell involved, that no one actually knew who was supposed to be giving Anderson's division orders. And so Anderson never received clear orders to attack. He just kind of attacked on his own initiative. Once the assault had kind of coordinated up to his position in the line. And again, that's according to A.P. Hill's own account of the battle. But you also see this pop up at Chancellorsville, Second Manassas, Fredericksburg. Again and again, there are these accounts of these large briefings or grand councils that were conducted that simply never were held, according to the generals who were actually there at the time. So all that's something that I'd actually wanted to include in the initial video, but I had forgotten, and I was running. The video was running long, and so I ended up cutting that anyway. As I also ended up cutting perhaps what would have been a better explanation of what had happened with Ewell on the first day of the battle, which is the order that Ewell was given was, and I might be slightly misquoting this, but it was to take that hill if practicable and to avoid a general engagement. And again, these are contradictory orders. And just taking that one segment of, take the hill if practicable, had Lee been Ulysses S. Grant, okay, just comparing the generalship of the two officers, had Grant been in that situation, what Grant would have done was he would have told his commanding officer that he wanted that hill taken. It was key to controlling the battle. And then he would have specifically told that officer which units were going to be participating in the assault, who he was providing for that, because both the two main corps, Hill and Ewell's corps, who had engaged in the first day, they were a disorganized mess from that engagement. It was large groups of disorganized soldiers at that point. So he would have said specifically, this commander and this commander and this commander, they are under orders to gather whatever soldiers they have and to assist you in this assault. And Lee never did anything like that. Now, going back to that point earlier about the Army of Northern Virginia and letters home from the common soldiers, the Army of Northern Virginia, the Southern armies in general, but the Army of Northern Virginia in particular, had terrible desertion problems, really from the end of 1862 onward, even before things started to get really bad. If you read a lot of these accounts, now part of this was because of territorial losses, and so the strategic territorial losses. Men wanted to go home to protect their families, although you can even argue that is, of course, again, a failing of the Confederate command and their ability to handle the overall strategic situation that they were losing. Excuse me. They were losing so many men to this concern. But if you read a lot of these letters that these guys are writing, a lot of them they have a lot of gripes about their officers. And I'm not just talking about the guys who are in near proximity, but from all the way from the entire command on up down. They don't feel as though they're being respected. They don't feel as though their lives are really valued by Lee or even, again, by the people, the officers within their own regiment, within their own local command structure. And a lot of this has to do with this whole lost cause thing and how Southern society was constructed. Now, the lost cause narrative always portrays that the Confederate soldier had this fantastic fighting spirit and acts as though there was this great unity within the Southern armies, that they were kind of all acting with one great fighting spirit, and that morale was always high. This is absolutely contradicted by the letters that the soldiers are writing. And of course, a lot of officers within the Confederate command structure got their posts because of their family. So some of them did have a lot of military experience, but they got their posts because of who their family was. They essentially purchased their commissions, like not unlike within the British Army, because Southern society was very aristocratic. A lot of these guys were conscripts. The Confederates were conscripting even before the Union Army was, even though the Union Army generally takes more crap for this in popular culture. The Confederacy was conscripting first. But because of these sort of prevalent views within the Confederate Army, these patrician values, these aristocratic views, a lot of the officers really did not connect very well with the men who were under their command, and the men who were under their command sensed this. And again, it really comes through in a lot of those letters. Very different from the way northern armies were built. Granted, there were plenty of instances in the North of colonels becoming the regimental command because they paid to outfit the regiment or what have you. But a lot of times Union officers were elected democratically. They were elected from the larger body of those who had enlisted. So, just the ways that these societies were constructed really shine through in the ways that their militaries were organized on the individual unit level. And so that's, when people look at these as these old antebellum aristocratic values, they're not taking into account the negativity of a lot of these values and how this really had a very bad effect on the guys who had to do the actual fighting. I'm kind of rambling on there, but certainly later, when these narratives were being constructed in the late 19th century and early 20th century, that part of the story is eliminated altogether. Really, oftentimes because of who was writing the histories. A lot of these histories were written by generals. They weren't written by regular soldiers, though you can find some histories that are written by guys who were there at the time. And that kind of gets to another point that was commonly brought up by folks. The lost cause of it and how that got planted into American society after the war, and sort of its value into present day, or its value in terms of the popular imagination, and how that connects to the Lee mythos, and how that first, to tackle the Lee portion, how that connects to the Lee mythos is that by portraying Lee, as I said, as this like a perfect patrician guy who really valued the lives of those under his command and was of high moral upstanding character, they're supplanting Lee for they're creating a totem of Lee that's supposed to represent the entirety of the Southern planter class. And I think it's important that we look at who these guys really were, as I had tried to do in the video, to look realistically at what their worldview was, and how that in reality reflected the worldview of the pre-war South and what they were really fighting for. But then some people brought up the sort of larger point about deconstructing history, or historical revisionism. And, I don't expect everybody to have done this, but if you go back to my last video, the whole point of the channel is to look at history and to deconstruct it, and to look at how narratives are built. And as I made the point in my very first video, history is being revised constantly. History is not a series of facts of what actually happened. There is a thing that actually happened. There is a past that actually took place. However, history and historiography is built on these narratives that are convenient to the people who are telling the narratives at the time. And then this stuff, of course, becomes self-reinforcing. I'll take a really minor example of this to kind of point out how things can be, even things that we seem to take as basic historical facts can be rewritten and fashioned in a way that is convenient to the person who is telling the narrative. So to do that, I'll ask this question. How did John Reynolds die? When did he die, and where was it? Now, you might think that this is a settled point. He died at right around 10:15 a.m. on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, on the westward-facing slope of McPherson's Ridge, and he was shot in the back of the head while turning in his saddle, and this is often portrayed as though he was shot by a Confederate sniper. This is based on what his main adjutant, Sergeant, the name escapes me right now, but his main adjutant who was with him, in an account that this guy wrote 30 years later, and also bolstered by some accounts that were written kind of in the immediate aftermath of the battle about what had happened. But it turns out that actually there's a lot of controversy around this. That a lot of people who were actually there and who were actually present and actually doing the fighting contradict a lot of this, the story about what happened here. And these seem like very basic facts, but there are a lot of people who say that he was that were there, that witnessed it, say that he was actually shot around 10:45. So about 30 minutes later, he was shot on the western-facing ridge of McPherson's Ridge, and that he was directly facing the enemy at the time that he was shot. Why is this important? Well, because if the first narrative is what happened, then Reynolds was likely shot by a dastardly Confederate sniper who cowardly martyred the great general while he was riding and leading his men into battle. And this is further proof that the Confederates were dirty fighters. And as I said, he becomes a martyr because of that. Certainly, other Union generals were killed by snipers later on. However, if the second narrative is true, if the second set of facts is what actually happened, then in all likelihood he was shot by friendly fire. So that changes a lot, doesn't it? That and which one of those you want to believe likely depends upon your worldview and what you want to be true. There's been a lot of ink spilled over exactly what happened, comparing accounts and looking at various different facts that are known to try to rebuild and reconstruct what had happened. And of course, this is an incredibly minor view, like minor province of history that, you know, like some people who are very focused on the events of the first day delve into, but doesn't, like, the fact that there's even controversy around that tells you a lot about wider historical narratives and how they're built and why they're built, and how there can be very basic disagreement on the facts. And that's why, you know, the study of historical revisionism exists. That's why we study historical narratives. That's why we do this deconstruction. That's not some leftist, socialist, communist plot. Everyone's doing this all the time in order to, well, deconstruction isn't happening all the time. Deconstruction is generally the province of very serious historiographers, but revisionism is happening all the time. We fit these narratives to what is convenient. And even if you're talking about, well, obviously they should go with whatever his staff sergeant said. his adjutant who was there. He would seem to be the most knowledgeable. But something that we know about the human mind is that the more times you retell a story, the more you change the details to fit kind of what what you want to be confirmed to be true in your own mind. And so I'm sure that this sergeant, who again didn't commit it to paper until years later, probably told the story over and over and over and over again. And probably the detail was changed with the telling of the story. So, leaning back towards some of the comments that stood out to me, that kind of are shorter points I can touch on before I continue on with some of the stuff that requires longer explanations. Someone had mentioned that I was inaccurate in saying that Napoleon had been the originator of en echelon attacks, and that's true. That was the way I had said that was not accurate. What I should have said is that in terms of the person who had commented that had pointed out that Alexander the Great had used it, Frederick the Great had used it. What I should have said, which is more accurate, that Napoleon brought it in for more modern, almost entirely musket-driven, firearms-driven, rather, warfare. And upon that, I kind of realized that I could have given a better explanation of how en echelon assaults work. And so the general idea of it, of trying to get your enemy to overcommit their forces, or what I had said in the original video, is accurate. When rifle warfare, musket warfare came into play, it added another dimension, because what the en echelon assault does is it provides overlapping fields of fire to the side that's committing to the assault. And so you get more efficiency with your fields of fire that way. It kind of, however your enemy chooses to react, that is a benefit of it. And that was the part that Napoleon kind of drew out with his own military theories. I mean, it's one of those things that, like, there are a number of military strategies or tactics that are essentially invented at one point and then go out of style for whatever reason, and then are reinvented. Going back to that point about Napoleon, Napoleon's biggest military innovation, he made a lot of them, but one of the one that really stands out in terms of grand tactics is his use of column tactics, having columns of men go forward instead of just linear tactics, to kind of punch holes in the enemy line and then exploit that. And after the Napoleonic Wars, that basically went away for a very long time, until it was rediscovered, reinvented, until the German army invented, if you will, Blitzkrieg, or what we tend to commonly call Blitzkrieg now, which is again based on column tactics, but uses motorcades and tanks and things like that to do the job. And you find that a lot in military history. But that was the commenter who pointed that out. Was completely accurate. You were completely accurate. I kind of misrepresented that a little bit. Kind of thinking about whether or not I really want to go into the sort of the broader idea of how en echelon assaults work, because if you're really into military tactics, it is kind of interesting, but I'm not sure how many people are going to be interested in that. And there's sort of a broader video that I want to do later, kind of covering a lot of the misconceptions about Civil War tactics and why certain things were done the way they were during the Civil War. Things that have crept into the popular imagination because of facts that are kind of only half understood, or not really understood the people who have never experienced this type of warfare. And I might reserve that commentary for that later video that I plan to make. That's definitely one that's kind of out there, and it's bubbling up the top of my head, and eventually I do plan to get around to. Another point that was brought up by another commenter, this is one of the fairly recent comments that was posted not long before I started recording this, was that it was a critique of what I had said about a well thought out critique about what I had said about the Union Army never being able to bring its full manpower to bear against the Confederate forces. And as I said, I think it was well thought out, but I think it also misses an important point that kind of leads into one of the broader points I wanted to talk about. The commenter had mentioned that I was not keeping in mind the fact that the Union Army was able to invade the Confederate coastline with its numbers, and that shut down a lot of their coastal cities in the South. Also very true, also very accurate, but kind of feeding into one of the broader points I want to make about how the Confederacy managed its manpower disadvantage kind of goes to, and again, some of the comments that were made, the question of what should the South have done differently? And when you're looking at it, I think that there's a tendency amongst a lot of more modern military historians to sort of broadly make the claim that the South should have done something more like what North Vietnam did during the Vietnam War. And then the counter to that is that, well, that's just not how armies were built back then. That's just not how military strategy and tactics worked. But I think that counter argument misses a key portion to why, a key point to why the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces were successful. Yeah, a lot of it had to do with the specific tactics and the use of tunnels and intelligence and all that other good stuff in order to get a leg up on the United States Army. But the North Vietnamese victory, and something that's been repeated again and again by insurgent forces, comes down a lot more to how North Vietnam and the Viet Cong use their popular base of support, how they were able to utilize that to commit to sort of a reactive defense or attacks, very specific attacks on weak points within the South Vietnamese and United States forces. And when you're looking at it from that angle, when you're looking at it from the use of weak points, the use of closely mirroring your enemy and then choosing the times to attack and focusing more on small engagements to run down your enemy morale, that's something that the Confederacy very much could have done, and they didn't do. There were a lot of raids, don't get me wrong on that, and there were a lot of smaller battles that have kind of been lost to the mists of history, but the South was still very much thinking in the mold of this large set-piece battle setup. And in general, when you have these conversations, the thing that tends to come up is the thing that I mentioned here at the top of this segment, which is, well, that's just not how people thought back then. There was no precedent for that. And I'm going to draw this out in two ways. The first is that this Confederacy had a very good example in front of them for a military force that used small engagements, that closely shadowed the enemy, that focused more on disrupting logistics and tended to shy away from grand battles unless it was necessary to have any given point. And that was the American War for Independence. And in that war also, the British had control over the United States coastlines, and they had much more ability to position their soldiers where they wanted to and control the ports and control the coasts than the Americans did. But the Americans succeeded by ceding that advantage and just focusing on harassing the British when it was possible. And as I said, there were definitely set-piece battles, but except for a few very notable exceptions. They were in instances that were very well chosen by the American colonialists. Contrast that to what Lee seems to have actually taken his model for his campaigns, which was the Mexican War, Winfield Scott's strategy during the Mexican War. And, and during the Mexican War, the Mexican army was the numerically superior force, but it didn't have anything remotely close to the kind of numerical superiority that the Union Army had over the Confederate Army. And also, Winfield Scott was able to negate the Mexican Army's numerical advantage by first making it seem like this was going to be a border conflict before he then whipped around and landed at Veracruz and faced a much smaller Mexican force during that campaign. And then when you're looking at the breakout after Veracruz, Scott pushed through the mountains very quickly and rapidly advanced through the Puebla Valley and got to the other side, to Mexico City, utilizing a lot of unpredictable movements and force concentration strategies and tactics and things like that. And, once he got to Mexico City was fortified, but they didn't have the forces that they needed to maintain it. And of course, the city fell and the United States won the war. Again, this seems to have been the campaign that Lee was trying to emulate with his campaigns, but it's a very poor comparison because, naturally, as I said up at the top, the Mexican army was spread out. A lot of it was up near the border areas where the main assault, far away from the main assault. The Puebla Valley is not really analogous to Northern Virginia or Maryland because it's pretty flat, pretty open, but there are a few hills here and there that you can use to kind of duck behind and disguise your movements. And the thing about the fortifications of the Mexican army is that because of the history of Mexico, a lot of these fortifications were designed not to impede invading armies. They were designed to implement control over the populace of Mexico. And so they weren't placed oftentimes in the right positions to be able to block Winfield Scott's maneuvers through the valley. So it's not really analogous, and it certainly is not. It's not the type of strategy you want to emulate for a long war, and it's not analogous for a type of short, impactful victory that Lee was trying to win also. But also in history, when you're looking at these sort of arguments from ignorance, the notion that we're applying some sort of hindsight is 2020 is a comment I got a lot. Sort of standard to the actions of historical figures, or making arguments about what they could have known and what they couldn't have known. That sort of thing only holds up if you don't have anyone who is both prominent and proximate who is making an alternative argument. And there were people within the Confederate Army who were prominent and proximate to Lee and to the decision makers who were making alternative arguments for how the Confederates should manage the war. Two of the most prominent, Longstreet I mentioned a lot in that video, and I'll get back to him in a minute, but also Joseph Johnston. Johnston had advocated for a more defensive strategy, for the use of more small maneuvers, small army tactics, attacking federal logistical capacity, and creating a sort of boundary around the Confederacy that would allow for more of a defense in depth. And the Confederate command, especially Jefferson Davis, hated Joseph Johnston for this. As soon as Johnston was shot during the Peninsula Campaign, he was wounded during the Peninsula Campaign, Davis replaced him as quickly as possible. He's gleeful to get rid of him and replace him with Lee. And then for most of the rest of the war, Davis sort of held Johnston at arm's length and gave him sort of menial commands that would keep him away from making decisions that would have much of a profound impact on the Confederate strategy. And then, of course, once Davis was forced to concede that Johnston was the most qualified person to lead the Army of the Tennessee, Davis took the first opportunity to get rid of Johnston and replace him with John Bell Hood. And we all know how that ended, even though Johnston's strategy of defending Atlanta was working. Similarly, there's a book that I had ordered and I wish I had a chance to read before I made the video, the main video, but I didn't. It's by Harold Knudsen. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. I watched a video where he talked about it, and so I should know what it is, but I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. But it's James Longstreet, the Confederacy's most modern general. And it makes a much stronger case for Longstreet than I made in the video. And actually, what I was not aware of at the time is that Longstreet actually, he put together and presented a strategy to the Confederate War Cabinet that took into account and was very similar to the thoughts that I had outlined in my first video. And there's some other stuff in there that I was already aware of, about Longstreet's use of military intelligence, his use of tactics, how Longstreet really he understood the concept of the operational level of warfare prior to that concept having been formally invented by the Soviet Union with their deep battle theory in the 1920s and 30s, and really makes a very strong case for Longstreet in that book and his abilities and his thoughts, and makes it very clear that he had presented all of this to the Confederate command and they had simply rejected it. So those alternative theories were out there. The counter argument was out there, and they were aware of it. They just chose to ignore it and pursue the strategy that they pursued instead. And tying this back to the comment that I mentioned before about how the Confederacy was at a disadvantage from having to defend this long coastline, and that's how the Union's numbers came into play, the Confederate War Cabinet was, the way that they were thinking was so not in tune with reality that they essentially left New Orleans completely defenseless. It was a pathetically small force guarding New Orleans for the importance of the city. So it's like they weren't even thinking about these important things. They weren't even thinking about, well, how do we defend our coasts? It wasn't even, they had the men. The men were just in the wrong place because they were trying to do all these other things at the front, trying to defend this static front in the west, and then trying to commit to this offensive strategy in the east in Northern Virginia. And they weren't even thinking about really vital questions like, well, what if the Union Army lands in New Orleans? We better assign a much larger force to guard it. New Orleans is an incredibly defensible city. They just didn't commit the resources to doing it. And the fact that they didn't do that is just baffling. But yeah, again, it's just something that very obvious critique of the Confederate war strategy and things that they should have been looking at. So yeah, moving on to the next thing. All right. I got plenty of comments that were something along the lines of, if the cavalry assault that had been intended to go along with Pickett's charge, if that would have gone off correctly, then the whole plan would have worked. And it's just, I'm sorry, give it up. Like, honestly. So first, just focusing on Gettysburg, focusing just on Gettysburg itself. there's no reason, there was absolutely no reason to look at that situation and think, even if everything had gone perfectly to plan, even if Stuart's cavalry had somehow magically swept in, completely taken the entire federal army by surprise, and they'd been able to trap um, the Union Army between a hammer and anvil, and everything had gone off, that would have been decisive at that point. Lee had already expended so many men, so much supply, everything, like on the first couple of days of the battle. This is sunk cost fallacy at its finest, and a lot of his generals completely doubted this strategy. Again, like even so, that's like the first layer of this. The second layer of this is that there was no reason, the coordination up to this point had already been very poor. That had shown through on the first and the second day. So there was no reason to believe that this attack was going to go off as intended by the coordination. But then in addition to that, like, I know they had a low opinion of the Federal Army at this point, perhaps lower than what they should have had, but the Union soldiers weren't stupid. They had scouts out. They had picket forces. They had lookouts. They could see what was going on. They were going to intercept the Confederate cavalry. I mean, that's what was going to happen. So, it's either, again, it's far too low of an opinion of your enemy to believe that this was going to go off the way that it had been planned, and frankly, completely unwarranted optimism towards the level of coordination with your own army, given what had happened for the past couple of days. And again, like, all this bad coordination is because he is not bringing together all of his generals. He's not bringing together all of his commanders. He makes a habit of poor communication. So you have that. And then out of all the stuff I talked about in this video, of all the instances of poor communication, of all the times that Lee threw away large numbers of men for no reason at all, just sitting there and saying, but if the cavalry attack is just, no, I'm sorry. Like, I'm not trying to be mean. I'm really not, like, but no. There were a couple of folks who said that I didn't cite any sources. I did. They were at the end of the video. I cited several sources that I drew heavily upon, and just a lot of the other stuff I said is just kind of almost, to borrow an analogy, it's like public domain for Civil War buffs. It's just so oftentimes a lot of folks don't think to put all these things together under the same hood and analyze them as one thing. So a lot of it was just general facts, and then me offering the perspective of the geographic complications, talking about supply, and then kind of like bringing that all in together and saying, okay, now oftentimes we think of these things individually, but what does this mean when it's all brought together? Aside from just the comments about, what I'm doing being socialist history or whatever, or, dismissing what I'm doing outright. I mean, look, my perspective is my perspective. You can agree with it or you can disagree with it. My videos aren't for people who aren't willing to listen. I mean, that's just the bottom line. From day one, my channel, the concept behind my channel is that, excuse me, is that if you're willing to engage, if you're willing to listen, if you are willing to, or somebody who might be kind of teetering one way or the other, and is hearing a lot of things, a lot of historical narratives that are kind of forming their worldview. But you think that they can be convinced, or like, if you're just interested in history, like I'm not even necessarily 100% about convincing people here. As I said, the purpose of the channel is to talk about bad historical narratives. It's not to not necessarily to convince anyone. It's just, it just so happens that a lot of those bad historical narratives kind of are either cherry picked to reinforce people's worldviews of what's going on today, or it's self-reinforcing, as I said down earlier in the video. Either people cherry pick these views to reinforce what they already want to think, and or they what they think is reinforced by these views being so popular, these bad historical narratives, these faulty views being so popular. And so like that's kind of the point of, that's where my channel comes into like the convincing part, because of that. But outside of that, there were a couple of comments that the Lost Cause was a progressive project, that there was no Lost Cause narrative before the progressives took over. And I mean, that's just completely fallacious. Like a lot of this stuff was already being written, honestly, even before the war ended, certainly within a few years after the war ended. And then really, once a lot of the older generals, on the Confederate side, a lot of the older generals started to die off, in the early 1870s rather. Lee and a lot of those guys who really could have contradicted some of these things if they had chosen to do so. That's not always a guarantee either. You saw that quote I posted from Lee that was from 1869, 1868 rather. But had they chosen to do so, they could have counteracted some of this stuff. And once those guys started to die off, that's when you really start seeing Early start writing, and a lot of this stuff being based off of a lot of his writings. Nathan Bedford Stewart wasn't a historian, but he started when he was a question before congressional hearings. He put his own slant on the history of the South and what secession was about. Secession, not succession. Secession was about. And so that's when this stuff starts. And so, I've especially like, you hate to blame one person, but there is one person who certainly is most responsible for putting this out there in the public sphere, and that's Glenn Beck. With his show, in the late aughts, late 2000s and the early 2010s, because of his ability to sort of craft narratives. He one of the narratives that he was kind of responsible for crafting was the notion that the progressive movement was responsible for all of these ills of America. And I did a video. I think it was episode 5, I believe so. But I did a video that kind of covered the progressive era in that time period. I'm looking up right now which video that was. Kind of covered the progressive era in that time period. And it's episode 4, rather, I'm sorry. It is... So one of the key problems here is that a lot of folks have been convinced or have convinced themselves that progressivism is all one thing. And even today, it's not all one thing. As someone who hangs in these circles, believe me, there is a massive gap and divide between older and younger, and very highly educated and not so very highly educated, and rich and poor within these progressive circles. But during the progressive era, all being progressive meant was that you had this general understanding that the government should be doing something to improve people's lives, and it shouldn't just be all on private initiative. Coming out of the robber baron era and stuff like that. But the progressives disagreed. Other than that one centralizing idea, the progressives really disagreed wildly on what that actually looked like. And if there is any connection to, as I said back in that video, in 1912, Wilson, Roosevelt, and Taft were all running as progressives, but they all had wildly different visions for America. And then the 1916 election, Wilson was still running as a progressive, but he was clearly the much more conservative progressive in that race. And so, yeah, was Wilson claiming to be a progressive? Yes. Was he? I mean, according to what that meant to him at the time, it meant to a lot of other people, sure. But just because Wilson was obviously responsible for, Wilson was not responsible for the reassertion of a lot of these extreme segregationist norms. Wilson was not responsible for the rise of the second rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Rather, those things were happening, and they were putting Wilson into power. So, a lot of that, yeah. Wilson was the totem. He was the figurehead for a lot of the neo-Confederate and segregationists and extreme Jim Crow things that happened kind of after these populist movements in the South, especially in the Upper South, were finally crushed for once and for all time. That happened in the 1880s and the 1890s when the last of the sort of white poor and black poor coalitions that could win statewide elections. That's when they were finally shattered in the near South, not the deep South. That was never even a thing in the Deep South after the troops pulled out. But after that, and they were able to reassert control. Yeah, they happened to coincide with the progressive era, and they certainly put a lot of juice behind Wilson and a lot of connected political leaders. And it happened that at the same time, this is when you start getting a lot of states. A lot of states had public education for a long time, but this is when you start getting sort of intensive public education. And so, yeah, these things coincide. But if you'd ask any of the northern progressives, if you'd ask anybody who voted for Teddy Roosevelt, do you want it to be taught in your school was that the war was just over states' rights, or that the war was just a big misunderstanding, or that the war was in defense of these patrician Southern values? They'd have said, hell no. So, yeah, I mean, it's a very popular framing within conservative circles, but it's just not true. So, I got some comments about the, I defamed Lee and his tactical prowess by claiming that he relied too heavily on frontal assaults, and so therefore I was canceled right there. I just want to go over So Seven Pines, Beaver Dam Creek, Gaines Mills, Malvern Hill, Gettysburg on all 3 days, the Wilderness, North Anna, and Topany Creek are all examples of times that Lee committed, I would say, like at least a third of his force to a frontal assault. And in every single one of those instances, it was disaster. It was pretty much disastrous in terms of the casualty figures that his army sustained compared to the enemy. Um, the Wilderness would have been, the casualty figures would have been way worse had Longstreet, of his own initiative, not looked at the situation. Going back to the Civil War tactics in this video I want to make later, you know, Longstreet at the Wilderness was brilliant. He looked at this situation and said, "Look, the main reason for having these closely knit lines, that being to maintain communications, that's going to be pointless here. Communications are going to be effed. uh, Organization is going to go out the window." So he then took the initiative of ordering his men into heavy skirmish, which was something that they were well trained and knew how to do, and then ordering his forces to push forward that way. And that really minimized Confederate casualties in that battle, which would have been so much worse had Longstreet not done that. I just wanted to take a moment to point that out. It's not really central to the point, but I mean, that's come on. There are numerous examples, as I said, and I don't expect everybody to know this. Like, this is stuff I know just because I've studied this, I've looked into this. That's the whole reason I'm making this video, is because I know what's out there and what is popularly being traded in Civil War buff circles, amongst people who kind of have this casual interest in the Civil War. And I'm certainly not a professional myself, but not in this particular topic. But it's something that I've studied. And so I don't want to come off as snarky or mean or anything else like that. And I don't want to come off as that, and I don't want to be that either. But there are plenty of examples of these times that Lee relied on these tactics, and for large parts of his formations. And going back to the point I made about desertions within the Army of Northern Virginia, like the historian's point of view, and also the point of view of the Confederate War Cabinet and the generals and the politicians and the Confederacy at the time, is, well, we're winning all these battles. It gets more questionable when you get to the later ones, the ones that I mentioned, but they're thinking we're winning these battles. And so, yeah, we may be taking higher casualties. Not that they would have known that at the time either. We might be taking higher casualties than the Union. The point is, we're carrying the field at the end of the day. Our tactical objectives have been achieved. All the ordinary soldier is seeing is that they are losing a lot of guys around them. A lot of their friends are dying. A lot of their camp is a lot more empty at the end of every single one of these battles, and they're getting letters from home saying that James McLaughlin was killed today. Reggie Hill lost his leg, and he's recovering, but they don't know if he's going to make it because of infection. Like, that's what they're hearing back. And so the fact that the casualties were so high, like, they were feeling the casualties in these battles. And again, that goes to the kind of, sometimes I think lack of concern sounds a bit harsh, but lack of understanding within the Confederate command, about the effects that these battles are having on their men and on their national morale. So, you want to go back into that thing about how the South was essentially a feudal system. or even a caste system in a lot of ways, and you had these officers who were so that their viewpoint was so divorced from that of their own soldiers. Like, again, that's another thing that comes into play. So when you're talking about these patrician values, well, there you go. Um, so let me see here. I think that more or less covers it. That's not to say that there weren't other comments that stood out to me or that were great. And I'm gonna, in the weeks ahead, I'm gonna go down through and try to provide a response to the ones that need a response. I appreciate all of them, but we're running over an hour now, and my original conception for these videos was I wanted to kind of hold things to 20 minutes, so we've blown past that. But my next video is going, and also my voice is starting to die, if you can't hear that. My next video is going to be about the fall of France in 1940. And there's been a bit of a delay on that one for a couple of reasons. I've kind of referenced it in some of my past videos and posts and things like that. First, the depth and kind of breadth of the topic, making sure that I'm covering my bases and that I'm doing right by all you guys, is that's led to a more significant time contribution. There have been a couple of events that have been going on in my life as well that have added to that. But I got to be honest. The other thing about that this video that's coming up is the more I look into it, the more parallels I can see between what's going on, in the United States here right now, and what France was like in the 1930s, and it's I mean, it is both kind of anxiety inducing and depressing, but also I want to kind of make sure that I'm not incorporating too much of that into my video, and that I'm maintaining a more neutral perspective. And so I'm sure some of that's going to show up. I've already started doing some of the recording for that one. I'm sure some of that's going to show up, but I kind of wanted to make sure that those things remain as unstuck together as possible. In terms of just to give a brief reference here, in terms of the episode 7 on Oppenheimer, number a good, well, there were a couple of good comments on that one, but I hope that you guys will take a look at it. It's again, there's part of that where I reveal a bit more about myself, but it's for a good cause, to kind of explain what my position is with that. And as I say at the top of the video, I think some people will be surprised at where I'm going with that, based off of a lot of my based off the title and what some assumptions some people might make. So I'm going to cut out there. If you have any questions, comments, please leave them. I appreciate it. Even comments on some of the corrections or some of the explanations or some of the responses that I provided. I'm always happy to read those. But in the meantime, have a good day, everybody. Thank you very much. Take care.